Hello everyone, myself Anakha Sudheesh. Today we will be discussing the chapter 2 in social science history, that is nationalism in India. As we all know, our exams are going to be conducted in 2 terms and this chapter is included for the term 2 examination. So let's start. Today's learning objectives are impacts of First World War in India, idea of satyagraha, Rowlatt Act, Jallianwala Bagh, Khilafat Committee and Calcutta session. So let's start with the introduction of this chapter. In India and as in many other colonies, the growth of modern nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement. People began discovering their unity in the process of struggle with colonialism. But each class and group felt the effects of nationalism differently, their experiences were varied and their notions of freedom were not always the same. The Congress under Mahatma Gandhi tried to forge these groups within one movement. But unity did not emerge without conflict. In this chapter, we will discover how national movement developed and how non-cooperation captured the imagination of people. The First World War, Khilafat and non-cooperation. So let's see the impact of First World War in India. The First World War took place in the year 1914 till 1919. And as India was a colony of Britain, India was indirectly participating in the World War. It led to a huge increase in defense expenditure, which was financed by war loans and increasing taxes. Custom duties were raised and income tax introduced. Villagers were called upon to supply soldiers and forced recruitment caused widespread anger. In 1918 to 19, crop failed in many parts of India, resulting in acute shortage of food. This was accompanied by influenza epidemic. Many people perished as a result of famine and poverty. Now let's see the idea of satyagraha. Mahatma Gandhi returned to India in January 1915. He came from South Africa where he had successfully fought against the racist regime with a novel method of mass agitation called satyagraha. The idea of satyagraha emphasizes the power of truth and the need to search for truth. According to that, if the cause is true, that is, if the force is against injustice, then physical force is not necessary to fight the oppressor. Without seeking vengeance or being aggressive, any satyagrahi could win the battle through non-violence. Mahatma Gandhi believed that this dharma of non-violence could unite all Indians. After arriving in India, Mahatma Gandhi organized many satyagraha movements in various places. In 1917, he travelled to Champaran in Bihar to inspire the peasants to struggle against the oppressive plantation system. Again in 1917, he supported the peasants of Kedah district in Gujarat. Affected by crop failure and plague epidemic, they were unable to pay their revenue and were demanding that revenue collection be relaxed. In 1918, Mahatma Gandhi organized a satyagraha movement amongst the cotton mill workers. And these are the pictures of the satyagraha movements led by Mahatma Gandhi. The first is the Kedah satyagraha, the second the Champaran satyagraha and third the Ahmedabad satyagraha. The Rowlatt Act. Gandhiji in 1919 decided to launch a nationwide satyagraha against the proposed Rowlatt Act. It had been hurriedly passed through the Imperial Legislative Council despite the united opposition of its Indian members. It gave the government enormous powers. 1. To repress the political activity and 2. It allowed detention of the political prisoners without trial for 2 years. Mahatma Gandhi wanted to start a non-violent civil disobedience against such unjust laws and started with a hartal on 6th April. Reaction of the Indians to Rowlatt Act. Rallies were organized, workers went on strikes in various places and most of the shops were closed. Communications such as railways and telegraph lines were disrupted. Reaction of the British government. Alarmed by the popular upsurge and scared that the lines of communication such as railway and telegraph lines would be disrupted, local leaders were picked up from Amritsar and Mahatma Gandhi was barred from entering Delhi. On 10th April, the police in Amritsar fired upon a peaceful procession, provoking widespread attacks on banks, post office and railway stations. Martial law was imposed and General Dyer took command. Now let's know more about the Jallianwala Bagh incident. On 13th April, the infamous Jallianwala Bagh incident took place. On that day, a large crowd gathered in the enclosed ground of Jallianwala Bagh. Some came to protest against the government's new repressive measures, and others had come to celebrate the Baisakhi fair. Being from outside the city, they were unaware of the martial law. General Dyer entered, blocked the exit points, and opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds. His object was to create a feeling of terror and awe in the minds of satyagrahis. And these are the pictures of the Jallianwala Bagh incident. Reaction of the Indians. Crowds took to streets in most of the North Indian towns. There were clashes with the police and attacks on government buildings. Reaction of the government. The government responded with brutal repression, seeking to humiliate and terrorize the people. Satyagrahis were forced to rub their nose on the ground, crawl on the streets, and do salam to all sahibs. People were flogged and villages were bombed. Mahatma Gandhi called off the movement when people started using violent method against the Rowlatt Act and Jallianwala Bagh. Khilafat Committee. Mahatma Gandhi now felt the need to start a broad-based movement as the Rowlatt Act was mostly limited to cities and towns. But he was certain that he cannot start any movement without bringing Hindus and Muslims together. One way of doing so, he thought, was to take up the Khilafat issue. The First World War ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, and there were rumors that a harsh treaty is going to be imposed on the Ottoman Emperor, the spiritual head of Islamic world, the Khalifa. To defend the temporal powers of Khalifa, a Khilafat committee was set up in Bombay in March 1919. A young generation of Muslim leaders such as Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali discussed with Mahatma Gandhi the possibility of starting a united mass action against this issue. Gandhiji saw this as an opportunity to bring Muslims under a unified umbrella of national movement. Calcutta Session. Meeting of the INC leaders at Calcutta in September 1920. During the meeting, Mahatma Gandhi convinced the other leaders the need to start a non-cooperation movement in support of Khilafat as well as for Swaraj. Now let's see some important questions from this part. Why did Gandhiji decide to launch a nationwide satyagraha against the proposed Rowlatt Act? How was it opposed or organized? Explain. Gandhiji decided to launch a nationwide satyagraha. This act had been hurriedly passed through the Imperial Legislative Council. Indian members opposed the act. It gave the government enormous powers. One, to repress the political activity. Two, it allowed detention of the political prisoners without trial for 2 years. It was opposed in the following ways. Rallies were organized in various cities, workers went on strikes, shops were closed, communication, railways and telegraph lines were disrupted. The next question. Describe the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the aftermath. Which basic human rights did the British violate? The impact and incident of the Jallianwala Bagh. On 13th April, a large crowd gathered in the enclosed ground of Jallianwala Bagh. Some came to protest against the government's new repressive measures, and others had come to celebrate the Baisakhi fair. Being from outside the city, they were unaware of the martial law. General Dyer entered, blocked the exit points and opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds. His object was to create a feeling of terror and awe in the minds of satyagrahis. The impact. As the news spread, crowds took to streets in many North Indian towns. There were strikes, clashes with the police. The government too reacted with brutal repression, seeking to humiliate and terrorize the people. The satyagrahis were forced to rub their nose on the ground, crawl on the streets and do salam to all sahibs. People were flogged and villages were bombed. The British violated the freedom of speech and expression. The last question. Examine the effects of the First World War on the national movement of India. The war created a new economic and political situation. It led to a huge increase in defense expenditure, which was financed by war loans and increasing taxes. Custom duties were raised and income tax introduced. Villages were called upon to supply soldiers, and forced recruitment in rural areas caused widespread anger. In 1918 to 19, crops failed in many parts of India, resulting in acute shortage of food. This was accompanied by influenza epidemic. And that's all from my part. I hope you all like it. Now I hand over to Shreya. Thank you.